Welcome to Charity Village Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. For some thought leaders in the nonprofit sector, the minority rather than the majority have had the lion's share of influence on shaping policies that impact charities for far too long. Although the vast majority of charities in Canada are small, a minority of larger, well-funded organizations have dominated public discourse, influenced government policy, and regulation in the sector. We'll take a closer look at what the impacts have been historically and what we can do to make access to influence more fair and equitable, and more reflective of the sector and the communities it serves. We'll also explore the important role of the CRA's Advisory Committee on the charitable sector and its representation of organizations in Canada. To help us understand these important issues, please welcome Minnie Njeri Karanja, who's dedicated her career to socioeconomic justice and equity. Minnie works in the nonprofit sector in Canada and internationally through the lenses of intersectionality, justice, decolonization, equity, inclusion, and diversity. She helps nonprofit and social impact leaders on values-aligned strategies to drive transformative change in communities. She's the founder and executive director of Impact Weaving Coaching and Consulting, a social enterprise that offers educational resources and services on charitable status registration, fundraising, and executive coaching. From 2022 to 2024, she served as a member of the CRA's Advisory Committee for the Charitable Sector. Minnie also works as the Director of Innovation and Engagement at Pacific Legal Education and Outreach and is an instructor at the Simon Fraser University in the Nonprofit Management Program. Welcome to the podcast, Minnie.
Thank you for having me, Mary.
Well, we're so pleased to be speaking to you today about your experience serving on the CRA's Advisory Committee on the charitable sector. Maybe we could start with an explanation of what exactly the committee is and what work it does.
That's a wonderful way for us to start. The Advisory Committee on the Charitable Sector is it's a forum for the Government of Canada to engage in a meaningful way with the sector, with the charitable sector at large. It was established in 2019 by the Minister of National Revenue, then the Honorable Diane Leboutillier. And this was an opportunity for the government to actually make real commitment to recognize the value of the charitable sector, as well as to give an opportunity for voices to be heard from the sector to influence policies at different levels. So essentially, that's what it is. It's made up of members from the sector, um, and very diverse in terms of where the organizations are coming from geographically, in terms of the issues. And I know we'll get deeper into more of the representation of the sector members. In addition to sector members, there is representation from the CRA staff, as well as staff from the finance department.
And so, how are members on the committee chosen? What was your experience in joining the committee?
Yeah, most people are curious about that question. So generally, the CRA puts up an open public call inviting applications, and that's what I did. I saw the open call, I responded to it, and actually, I didn't hear for a while. I didn't hear a while after I made the application, and finally did get a call from the department, the Charities Directorate, letting me know that I had been appointed by the Minister of National Revenue to become a member of the ACCS. So membership is that's how one can be a member, and the onboarding process is there to help new members really just understand how it's working, what the responsibilities are. Of course, there's a terms of reference, and because it's within government, you have to go through security, for instance, so security checks, and I had to go through a long process of onboarding in that way. But essentially, that is how one becomes a member. In the open call, there is a criteria by which the CRA says this is how we are going to prioritize who is going to be selected. But in terms of, is there an interview, for instance, there was no interview after that first application. I don't know whether that's going to change in future, but that is the process at least I'm aware of.
That's so interesting to know, having not ever gone through it. I'm sure that a lot of people out there in the sector also were curious about how this occurred. And what are the working groups of that are actually formed under the committee? How does the committee work with other working groups, such as the technical issues working group, for example? Um, could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, so working groups are very, let me say, maybe fluid. So when I joined the ACCS, we had four working groups, and we still had four at the end, but some had shifted. So really, working groups are, I would say, an effective way for the ACCS to self-organize in terms of issues that they want to engage in. I was involved in the working group, the relationship between the CRA and the sector. And we had our priorities within that. There is another working group, data, one that is focused on data collection and understanding how can we effectively collect data for the sector and how can we use it to influence policy, as well as another working group on definition of charity and charitable status. Now, for instance, that working group has gone through various iterations in terms of, just what it's called, but also in terms of priorities. Since 2019, this issue of charitable definition and purposes, it's been of interest to the to the ACCS. So that working group has continued. When I The group before I joined the ACCS had two other working groups that were dropped during my term. So there was a group on indigenous peoples. There was also another group on vulnerable populations. Now, those two working groups were not part of our current, or at least when I was there, the working groups that were there. And how the working groups work with the technical issues working group, for instance, is there is no collaboration. The technical issues working group, in fact, I'm not there. We did never have a meeting with them. Uh, Not aware of what their priorities were, what issues they were looking at. So these two working groups really work, I would say, in isolation. There is hardly any um, interaction, any sharing of knowledge. The CRA consults them separately as they consult the ACCS.
So it sounds like you're sort of working in silos, at least in terms of the various working groups. Eh, Do you think that's productive?
Um, so the silo really is between the working group, the technical issues working group, and the ACCS. Within the working groups in the ACCS, there is actually some opportunities for members to learn from one another what is happening in the groups. We frequently had meetings together to hear what each working group is working on. However, there's no opportunity to really delve into the issues of what a working group is going into. So, for instance, if a working group, say the definition of charity and charitable status, if they're doing really in-depth work and research comparing that to what's happening across Canada or in other foreign jurisdictions, that is work that they're going to be doing themselves, and they'll be reporting back to the group, to the larger group. So we would really want to have an opportunity to influence, what are the research questions, for instance. And this is where I feel that more can be done. I understand, that there are constraints in terms of time and just how many issues we can deal with. However, it's really challenging to move things when you're not doing it as a collective, and that's where I feel it may not be as effective. It does work. It helps us to get a sense of what is going on. I think when I joined, I was so curious because all the working groups are really doing amazing work, and I wanted to be part of more than one working group. There's only too much time to go around. So a lot of members just find that they're just really working within one working group and they just depend on the updates from the others.
Right. So, do you feel these working groups are a good way of making progress on the priorities of the committee and, its mandate?
That's a good question. Is it they get the work done in terms of raising the issues? However, I feel that there is an opportunity for the ACCS to organize better. Working groups are they're a starting point in terms of raising the issues, but in terms of moving things forward, really, I think what needs to be done is for the ACCS to collectively identify priorities and work on those, not in a working group. I did not find that the working group were fully efficient in being able to address those issues because, again, we don't have an opportunity to collectively get a sense of what needs to be done, and decisions are being made before they're brought into the larger group. And at that point, we need to start backtracking. We need to start saying, no, I think we need to go into this direction and finding consensus on issues. So it is really actually challenging to move issues as a collective when we've organized ourselves as a working group.
Right. And because of the divisions and the lack of communication prior to the final reports to each other, I suppose, is what you're saying that
Yeah, there's
perhaps.
some of that. Yeah, I mean, some groups try as much as possible to offer updates, but often it was updates where a decision has already been made that this is how we're going to address this particular issue, where I think there needs to be more opportunity to hear from the collective and have an agreement and say, yes, we all agree that this working group needs to go in this particular direction. I know that we were successful sometimes to do that, but in other times, some working groups had really advanced in making some really critical decisions, which I believe needed to have been made at the collective stage.
At an earlier stage, yeah,
Yeah,
having great more voices, I guess.
absolutely, yes.
And what were you mentioned some priorities that you were pursuing in the work that you were doing, but what were the priorities during the term? And how were those priorities chosen and how much progress was made by the end of your term?
Okay, that's a packed question, and this is why. So, when I joined the ACCS, we started off by looking at the priorities that the group before us were looking at. And we had a really long list of priorities that were needed to be continued. And the spirit within the ACCS is that at the end of every term, the group wants to see that the next group coming will be able to advance those issues. So we were really committed to make sure that all the work that the group had done was able to continue. However, as we went through that process, we realized that there's only so much capacity that the CRA has. So we really had to bring down the priorities. And this is where, I mentioned that there were two working groups that were dropped off and some of the work that we had to let go of that. So in a way, the priority my of the group and my term was to narrow down the priorities of the previous group and really work within what was feasible within the charities directorate given its limitations, talking about budget, its scope of work, and so on and so forth. So that became a real priority for us. And I feel like we spent that 1 year just really trying to say, this is actually what we think we can move forward. In my working group, really, it's the working group, the CRA, and the relationship between the CRA and the charitable sector working group. Our priority were to make sure that we had two key activities that we really wanted to see and devoted ourselves to saying how can we recommend to CRA to number one, the charitable application. The charitable application process is very rigid. It's very complicated, and we have heard from the sector just how difficult it is to navigate that. The other priority is education. The CRA, there was a time, I believe, could be decades ago now, that used to have a lot of outreach to help organizations stay compliant to be able to answer their questions. It's very difficult to get on the CRA and have you answered have your questions answered, because there's limited capacity. There are other issues of, it's no secret that a lot of people complain that you get different answers when you call the CRA depending on who picks up the phone, time of day, and so on and so forth. So really, it was about the regulatory process, making sure that that is smooth, that it's meeting the needs of the sector. Those, I would say, largely were the priorities within our working group. And then there are other, so the way it's difficult to have the generally the ACCS mandates is to help the CRA listen to the sector, understand what emerging issues are, and help them in their own priorities to make sure that they are, they're looking at things in the most equitable way, for instance. So I feel like this is a long-winded question to answer your question about the priorities, but really, this has been a challenge. Narrowing down the priorities of the ACCS has been a real challenge for us, or was a real challenge for us.
Were there any successes that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think I would share the successes, just going back to what I shared about the application process. We know that we were able to really make a case to the charities directorates that the application needs to change. And I know they're taking that very seriously, and the sector could be seeing something coming out very soon. I can't tell when, but we know that they're taking it very seriously. We went through a process of really um, going through the questions and saying, this is where we think you could ask better questions. This is how you can simplify the questions and the processes. When it comes to education, that I can already see that the CRA is already making progress in that. It's in the first quarter, I believe I've already seen two webinars coming from the CRA. There's been a webinar on helping charities properly do the the receipting, the donation receipts. Really, this is how the CRA expects you to do it, and giving opportunity for charities to come on and ask questions. The other place that I've seen, there was also a webinar on foundations granting to non-qualified donees. Granting to non-qualified donees is very new, and there are a lot of questions. It's a bit messy at the moment, and so a lot of people are needing guidance. So I'm happy to see the CRA stepping up and coming out and doing the outreach and making space for people to ask questions. So I think this is real progress in terms of what the ACCS has been able to achieve and advocate. Yeah.
That's good news that you feel that there was some I guess improvement in terms of the educational outreach that the CRA is doing to help with these very challenging new sort of procedures. So that's really great news. Do you, I guess more broadly, do you feel that the committee did a good job of representing the diverse experiences and opinions in the sector, including in representing small charities?
That's a very critical question, and one that I've been pondering about. So when you look at the ACCS's membership, it's certainly a diverse group. We're coming from different sectors. There's a lot of representation. However, what one takes time to uncover is the power dynamics. So there is, in my opinion, an overrepresentation of large, white-led, really well-established organizations, and that means something. The ACCS, of course, is functioning within a colonial structure, and when there is this overrepresentation of these groups, one really has to wonder about what views and opinions are being advanced. During my term, we had one indigenous organization, and one Black-led organization. Um, that's not acceptable. It really is not acceptable today to have that sort of representation and be okay with it. There needs to be more voices. There needs to be an opportunity where we are today, the sector itself and the Canadian society, we're at a point of reckoning with, you know, the racial injustices and inequities, um, all the things that come with capitalism, the things that come with colonial structures. There needs to be a way that the ACCS needs to speak about these issues. It's there to represent the sector and the issues of the sector. We're there to offer our recommendations, yes, but there needs to be recommendations that are grounded in justice, equity, and inclusion. So while I do see the diversity in terms of, who is sitting around the table, it really is not. And having one Indigenous organization and one Black-led organization, really, it borders tokenism to me. And there needs to be a serious discussion. There needs to be some uncomfortable conversations that are happening. And the other thing to note is with the power dynamics, it's not very clear how the minister decides who the co-chairs are. At least that was not very clear to me, whether there's a criteria, whether there's an opportunity to apply or to ask for recommendations within the group. So, with all these other representations of mainstream organizations, these really well funded organizations, who themselves represent, again, the well funded, the philanthropies with a lot of dollars in the sector, neither the Black-led organization or the Indigenous organization were chosen by the minister as co-chairs. Again, that's a co-chair, although decisions are made in consensus, the co-chairs have a huge responsibility in driving the agenda. So again, who drives the agenda within the ACCS? Who gets to ask questions about where we go next? What is a priority? What is not a priority? So to answer your question, I feel that the ACCS really did not do a good job in terms of managing the power dynamics. It seemed like it was representative when you looked around the table, but the power dynamics really played a critical role in terms of what was in the agenda and how we could run the meetings essentially.
So I guess I'd be curious to take it more broadly, to given the kind of background, the work that you do, to understand whether the advisory council on the charitable sector has enough representation for the sector with the government, or on an advocacy level for issues that the sector is struggling with. I mean, we are up against some major challenges today based on the economic impacts and the kind of a social policy that we've seen coming south of the border and actually having an impact on Canada. How do you think this, I guess, this limitation of representation, this lack of, or even potentially tokenism, can impact the kind of advocacy that the sector needs so much right now, as we're facing such increasing demands on our services, and also an extremely changing and diverse community that we're serving.
Now, I want to go back to the mandate of the ACCS. And this is where it gets really interesting because the ACCS is just a forum for the government of Canada to consult and to understand what's happening in the sector. It's not a place for advocacy. And this is something that the group really had to grapple with when we joined. The ACCS is not a place where we can have an opportunity to advocate for the sector. Again, there is no opportunity within the charities directorate itself. It's only one department within government and really does not have capacity to handle advocacy from the sector. So just just to start by saying that it's not the place to advocate for the sector. It really does not feel the place to advocate for the sector, given all the issues that we're up against. The scope of the ACCS working within the Charities Directorate is really very limited to what the Directorate can do. Its scope of work is regulatory. So for the sector to be able to do some advocacy work within a regulatory um, or within with a regulator is very challenges. There is a conflict and a friction, I would say, because they're looking to regulate our sector. They're not looking to give us space to advocate and talk about all the issues that we need to address. And that is why when I talk about what the sector is up against today, it's not enough. There needs to be more than the ACCS. The ACCS is good to offer recommendations, and it was made very clear to us that we cannot go beyond the scope of the Charities Directorate. It's very, very limited in terms of what it can do. If we are to find a place, it has to be outside of the ACCS to talk about what's happening south of the border. Those are big issues beyond the mandate and the scope of work of the ACCS and of the Charities Directorate, which manages the ACCS. So I believe there needs to be more. The sector needs to think of organizing in other ways and not wait for the ACCS to do any sort of advocacy, because the mandate was broad and it was not true to what the sector was looking for. I think there's not a lot of work that went to consulting the sector in terms of what the ACCS would be looking at, like advocacy. We saw the terms of reference, and it seemed as though we would be able to do some advocating, which we tried at the beginning. Like when we went in, we said we want a home in government, for instance. And it's like home in government. The charities director is like that is really beyond our scope, because you're talking about advocating with other government departments. We don't do that sort of cross work with other departments. We just work on our scope of work here, and you're going to be within our scope of work. So immediately, that means that there's not much opportunity, Mary, for the ACCS to do advocacy work. It can only do as much as it can within the scope of the CRA.
So, and you said that very clearly, and I certainly understand that the limitations of its mandate really prohibit that kind of activity. And I'm curious then, given that you learned this as part of your experience in joining it, outside of the advisory committee, what do you think is needed? I mean, you mentioned the home and government. I assume you're in favor of that. Is there a greater need as well for a kind of advocacy platform or network or organizations that need to take place as well to exercise this advocacy kind of initiative?
Yes, I feel that there is a leadership vacuum in our sector at the moment when it comes to advocacy. And I want to say, in terms of home and government, I'm not I'm not fully in favor of it. I think we need to have a conversation about what that needs to look like. I see the devil is in the details in terms of how it might be organized, how it may be governed. Again, what we've seen or what I have observed in the sector is we have these larger organizations with a lot of budget to do advocacy, government relations work that they just it's very easy for them to influence policy, to say yes, home in government, this is what we think the sector needs, without really asking the sector what it needs and asking across the sector what the needs are. So I think there needs to be a way for the sector to organize that is obviously outside of the ACCS and outside of a particular government department. I don't think that being confined within one department is going to be helpful for us. The issues that we deal with are not just for one department. And we don't want a situation where we are, for instance, within ESDC, say that's the next best place we can be outside of the CRA, where you go and talk to the Justice Department and they are saying, no, you go back to ESDC. That is where you belong. I don't think that will be in favor of us. I believe we need to have a body, a I don't know how we can do it, who's going to, it needs to be inclusive. It needs to be centered on gender equity. It needs to be focused on all the cross-sectional, intersectional issues and diversities within our sector to be able to really move things forward. Um, Again, I feel this is a body that needs to be outside of government, but working very closely with all levels of government and across departments to be able to be effective. And that's our challenge right now as a sector. When we try to advocate, we don't have a home in government. Maybe we want one or don't want one, but we need to have a place where we can come and have these conversations. Have make space and say this is how we think we're going to do it. And maybe that's the work that we continue to build on in the years to come. I don't believe it's easy to have people come together, build consensus around advocating for the sector, because every group, every organization has priorities that they need. But I really believe it's possible. It is possible.
So, do you think some of the umbrella organizations or the organizations that are out there now that I guess purport to advocate for the sector, are they themselves limited by a lack of representation? Is that your observation? Like, what are your thoughts around the effectiveness of what's the sector leaders that are in place in various organizations across Canada in terms of having an influence that is actually representing the majority of charities in Canada?
The thing that I observe right now is that majority of the network organizations that have the bandwidth, the budget to be able to do all this advocating on behalf of the sector are, again, really well established white led organizations that don't have a lot of membership of these smaller charities. So that's why I believe that there needs to be more than the network organizations that are speaking, quote unquote, on behalf of the sector, because I really don't truly believe that they are all speaking on behalf of the sector. And sometimes I have found that network organizations are only representing the organizations under them, and that's because it's a section of the sector, make it appear as if they're representing the rest of the sector. Well, that is not true. Some of these network organizations are really large and they have membership in the thousands. Now, that is just a section of the sector is large. Just having a large membership within your organization does not mean that you're representing the sector. You're only representing part of the sector. And a lot of what some of the larger organizations, again, they're representing the majority mainstream organizations. The question is, where are the smaller charities? Where are the smaller underrepresented communities that are grassroots, for instance, that are not members of this larger organization, these larger network organizations? And that's where the equity piece is missing. I don't believe they're limited, and I truly believe that they can make space if they wanted to. They have the budgets, they have the time, they can go out and cultivate relationships across the sector and really be a representative for the sector. It is possible. Unfortunately, it's the case that it's about advancing the needs, the issues of one part of the sector without without really representing the rest of the sector, but making it appear that it is on behalf of the sector again. So I don't believe there's any limitations there. It's just um, maybe a willingness, the will that's missing, and we need to cultivate that in our sector, the collaboration and making space and room for others.
So the organizations, I guess, are kind of beholden to the members that purchase the memberships that allow them to give voice to what are the important issues for the members.
Oh yeah, absolutely, 100%. And I don't know whether that is that's just our own organizing, that we need to think about membership, and you become a member, and this is, you want your issues advanced. That's why you're a member. That's why you you pay the membership dues, or attend those meetings. Is you want to make sure, and I'm thinking here of philanthropic foundations, for instance, that has the membership that have particular interest, really specific interests when it comes to how they want to see things going on in the sector. And 100%, if you are in that organization, that's your commitment. And how do you make room, however, in addition to meeting the needs of your membership, how do you make room for others that are not part of your membership, and really think holistically about advancing all the issues in the sector? That's I think that's a challenge.
I guess when I think about that, an example might be, for example, the work and the advocacy for the increase in the disbursement quota, for example, and the discourse around that and the advocacy around that. I've heard that from other thought leaders that there was the voices that were dominant were not necessarily reflecting the interests of the wide number of charities that were out there.
Not a doubt. Not a doubt, and not a surprise. Again, there is a large section of our sector that is loud, has the means to be loud, the means to reach the right people within governments and in other influential areas to advance their own needs. There is the larger organizations that they have the means, they have the political influence, they've been around for a very long time and have built critical relationships. So what you're saying is I'm not surprised by that. I'm not surprised that a large part of the sector is thinking that um, there's an unfair opportunity that some organizations have just by the way they have benefited from capitalism, the way they've benefited from racial injustices that allows them to continue to advance while others are kind of like going backwards. They're not having access to as much funding, they're not able to influence policy in the same way. So I think really the larger organizations, they have a real responsibility to make sure that when they speak, when they find themselves in these places of influence, that they're not going alone. They're going with other smaller, underrepresented charities and groups to be able to say, we are truly representing the needs in the sector. I know it's really challenging. The conversations about increasing the DQ are quite, they were quite heated when those conversations were happening as to what is reasonable. Why do we need to think about self-preservation rather than what needs to happen today so that tomorrow we're not dealing with the same issues? That was not an easy thing to navigate, and I know that wherever we ended is because some larger organizations have, they had a voice that could be heard in the right places. And hope in future we can have a different conversation about how we handle such big changes that impact across the sector, and how do we make sure that every part of the sector, every part of the charitable body is heard, not just the few that continue to hold on to resources and deny others. Yeah.
Well said. I've heard that from other folks as well, and that we're still struggling with finding a way to do that effectively. I wanted to move back to the CRA, for example, and just talk about some of the issues around. I guess to some extent, we've heard that many small charities are really quite fearful of their relationship with the CRA, even to the point of not wanting to call CRA to ask questions. They almost don't want to raise their head to be kind of on the radar. Given that you've worked closely with the CRA and that you've helped organizations get charitable status, do you have any thoughts to share on this? Like, what should they think about if they have those feelings and their reservations?
Yeah, that's a good one. Or even private citizens don't want to call the CRA. No one really wants to call the CRA about anything. So not it's we've heard the same in the ACCS, and we talked about this issue at length. Really, this has become a barrier to charities getting the help that they need when they need it. That they are just really fearful of calling the CRA. And we told the CRA, people are afraid of you. Now myself and the others on the ACCS, we've really had an opportunity to know the Charities Directorate team. They are really passionate. They love the sector. They want to be there for the sector, and that was surprising that they want to know what's up. How can they help? How can they support? How can they make sure that when the charities call, they get the help they need, the answers that they need? So I would encourage charities to try. You don't get in trouble with the CRA. They really do want to help, and I see them as really committed to the sector. So yeah, some of them that are working there have had, they work volunteer within the sector. They've had relationship with the sector. They have charities that they love and causes that they love and care about. So I'd encourage charities not be too fearful, and just know that they're they're rooting for the sector. They want to help the sector. As I said, some of what we've recommended to them, the outreaches, those are very important. I think the more outreaches the CRA does, the more the sector will be able to see more and more of them and understand that, yes, they are a regulator, but also they are wanting to see the sector succeed. And, as much as I've talked about the limitations of the ACCS, really they are listening. They want to know what they can do, obviously within the scope of work and their mandate. But I'd encourage charities to start to start, and like any other agencies, if there are any issues, you can report them. They're ready to deal with those. I know they're also doing some important work around understanding how they can serve different populations, underrepresented populations, for instance, that have not had a relationship with the CRA or are just starting to have a relationship with the CRA. So I know they have like anti-bias training that their staff are doing when they pick up calls, that they're able to really be responsive. And I applaud them for that. So again, just to the charities, take a chance. Don't be too fearful. They're here to help.
Well, that's that's encouraging news, and I appreciate, Minnie, that you've had the personal experience that gives you that insight, and I think it's helpful to share that as well. We've talked about this, about how when we look at the nonprofit and charitable sector as a whole, it does seem that there's a number of large entrenched organizations who seem to get the lion's share of funding, opportunities for advocacy, speaking on behalf of the sector. What do you think needs to happen to create more equity in this regard? Like, what would you like to see happen? What have you sort of contemplated how this could take form to actually change that and make it more reflective of the sector and the communities they serve?
Would you be referring to the ACCS, or are you
No,
referring generally
outside of
to?
the ACC, just generally
Mhm.
in the sector.
Generally in the sector, really, there needs to be a way for us to see each other and to care about one another. It's interesting for me to use these words because this is an industry that is built on love, on caring for for the needs of others. However, we are finding ourselves in today's world divided, divided amongst ourselves while serving the people that we all care about. And the problem, in my view, is funding. Government has kind of the they've made us go against ourselves because we are competing. It's now become a competitive space that, an organization has sometimes to think about its own survival before it can think about the survival of others. And that's really unfortunate. And, you know, just um the lack of recognition by the government of the sector. We do really important work, but the government does not yet see us as GDP contributors, though we are one of the largest GDP contributors, but yet the government does not see it that way. They give us the peanuts. Well, you think about how much they hand to businesses, and we saw that during COVID, that they were very supportive of small businesses, which is good. We need small businesses, but it took them a while to support our sector because they're yet to have a good understanding and appreciate of what the sector contributes. And it's ironic because they depend on us. They depend on us for healthcare to provide these services. They depend on us to provide frontline services, all critical services. The nonprofit sector really shows up when we're needed. We show up in places where others are not willing to be seen, and we're the first. So much has happened in this country to bring us to where we are, to enjoy some of the social comforts that we enjoy today because of this sector. And that is where we need to have advocacy. If we were to start somewhere advocating for the sector, we need to see the government looking at the sector as a serious contributor in the economy. Because once they do that, they will reduce some of the competition that we're having to deal with. Um, and then once, we've had those conversations, we need to think about how we relate with one another. How are we in relationship? How are the larger organizations that have benefited from from the theft that has occurred in Canada? Think about, obviously, talk about indigenous people here, the those that have benefited from that. We need to have those deeper conversation about how wealth has been created, how it's being distributed, redistributed, being held, who is benefiting from that, who continues to benefit, and who is being disadvantaged from that continually. Because there are organizations that year after year they are seeing a diminishing in their capital in terms of what they can access. Yet in those very same communities, year after year, they're seeing an increase in what they have to deal with in their sector. So the sector needs to look inside. We can't have government solve these issues for us. They don't have the capacity, they don't have the interest, they don't have the breadth. They don't have it. They don't understand us. We understand ourselves better. We know when we're being inequitable. We know who needs to be around the table. Government does not, and that is why some of these larger organizations have been able to continue succeeding. It's because they don't know the sector. If a well-established organization says we are representing the sector and we have this sort of diversity, they'll say yes because they don't know any better. Some may disagree with me that they know better, but from my experience interacting with these government departments, There's so much turnover as well. The person that you talk to today in the SDC is not the person you're going to talk to 2 years ago. And you're always going to be starting from scratch, explaining who the sector is. And people they've benefited from that, because if they worked with the previous person, they continue leveraging on that, and without anyone asking them. So the sector really needs to have those conversations internally, sit down, and they're difficult conversations. There are no easy answers to this, but if we are to see some progress, we really need to sit down with these conversations ourselves. So there's no there's no easy answer here, Mary. It's just doing the hard work that we ask others to do. We're the sector that asks others to do better. Maybe we need to ask ourselves to do better.
Well, I have another tough question, maybe to wrap us up. I'd like to have us look to the future. We've talked about what Canada's facing in the immediate short term that could potentially be our long term, which is things like the impacts on our economy due to the tariffs, the social impacts based on public discourse about that is also coming from south of the border as well. That's impacting the public discourse and in Canada as well around issues around immigration and diversity, etc. These are really, really challenging times. And I'm curious whether, in many respects, we've certainly seen these dire circumstances and the threats to actually unifying Canadians in recent weeks in a way that we haven't seen, certainly not in my lifetime, before, very quickly and very passionately. I'm curious whether you think that perhaps what the not-for-profit sector is facing now will also, in a similar way, I guess, galvanize a kind of unity among nonprofits about what they have to do to make change in order to be, I guess, a stronger advocacy for the sectors and the communities that they serve. Where do you see us going in the next year to 5 years? Do you think we're at a turning point, and where do you want us to go?
Yeah, adversity has a way of bringing people together. But there needs to be the will. There needs to be the leadership that is there. What I have observed for instance, with everything that's happening with the tariffs right now, is that the business community has come together, speaking in one voice. I would like to see the nonprofits coming together to speak in one voice in the midst of everything that is going wrong in our sector and what could possibly go wrong. It's not a surprise that what's happening south of the border is going to come here, has arrived here in some form or the other. We're going to have to deal with those issues when they are fully here present with us. And now is time to prepare ourselves for that. How are we going to respond? And I haven't seen those conversations yet. Is how would we respond when those policies arrive here? We're just looking there and saying, oh my gosh, that is so bad. That would never happen here. But really, it may, and I don't think it's going to surprise anyone when it finally does. Is we need to have a united voice. That's what I would like to see. The sector is, again, it's built on love, care for one another. We need to have a united voice saying this is what we want to see. We need to stop being divided by circumstances. We need to say these circumstances are affecting each and every one of us. Let's have a conversation about how everybody is doing. What supports do people need to be able to navigate these times? And then come up in one voice and say, these are the 10 things as a sector. This is what we are demanding. This is what we want to see happen. And without that leadership, I think this is a moment where leadership can be taken out by organizations that are willing to step up and do the work. Granted, it's going to be this, we're going to need support. Say if it's is a small charity that's going to say, I want to take on that role, they're going to need to be supported. And this is where, again, we need to show love and care for each other. That if they're taking up leadership, they're spending their resources, their time, their energy, which means if you're doing this work, what you're supposed to be doing, your responsibilities, you need support with that. You need someone backing you up. So the sector needs to back each other up and speak in one united voice. So, 5 years from now, I hope we can have that voice. I hope we can have small, large, medium charities working together from all communities represented, speaking in one voice on behalf of the sector, because we cannot continue to survive in this way. This survival mode, the competition mode, it's getting us exhausted. It's getting us not wanting to work with each other because everyone is just like in a really bad mood looking for funding or trying to deal with whatever issues that are going to come up. So I think, Mary, that's what I think we need to do: speak in one voice, support one another, in the hope that the sector will get the recognition that it needs and will be able to advance the causes that really Canadians are waiting for us to deliver on those causes.
Well, Minnie, thank you very much for your keen insights and sharing your experience and advice with our audience. It's sure to help charities struggling to both gain a greater voice and achieve more equitable level of influence within the sector so that it better reflects the sector at large, but also the diverse communities that they serve. I also think that, your closing remarks are really inspirational, and I think they're capturing the moment really well. And I sort of see that need for unity within the sector itself as being really critical to success as well. And I just really appreciate you sharing all your thoughts and your experience. It's really a great benefit to the sector. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. These are issues, and the conversation is very enjoyable to me. I'm like, wish we could have continued speaking about all of this, but thank you for having me. I care about these issues, and I hope to see the sector becoming better as we should be. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
agree.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks for joining Charity Village Connects.
Thank you.